Welcome to the National Interest Speakers Series. My name is Justine Rosenthal. I am the editor of the National Interest, and I'm here today. I have a very lofty guest, Ross Douthat, who is now a columnist for the Times. I knew you back in the day when you were already important at the Atlantic.
And when I was carrying other people's papers at the Atlantic.
Well, so now we get to hear you pontificate, I hope, on all things election 2012, in part just because we're the National Interest, focusing on foreign policy. Let's start with the question of Osama bin Laden, capture, kill means what for the Republicans in 2012?
Well, I think the most likely thing is that it takes what had been sort of the most common Republican critique of the Obama presidency. It doesn't take it off the table completely, but it certainly weakens it. I think that Republicans have struggled in a way to sort of fasten on what it is that they don't like about Obama. Obviously, he's a Democratic president, right, so there has to be something they don't like, but he's been on foreign policy a kind of ideologically undefinable figure in certain ways, and so you've had a real range of Republican reactions, ranging from the, he's a far-left George McGovern clone, to he's a dithering Jimmy Carter-esque weakling, to, the Republicans who say, well, but actually what he's really vindicating George W. Bush by carrying forward all of his, anti-terrorism policies and so on. And I think that the critique that Obama is sort of weak, somewhat post-American, that he apologizes for America too much, that he's uncomfortable with American power and so on, that had become probably the most common critique that you heard among would-be Republican contenders for the presidency, right? From, sort of dark horses like Rick Santorum to your Mitt Romneys and Tim Pawlenty's and so on have made a version of that argument. It's not a coincidence that Mitt Romney's book was called, right, No Apologies or No Apology, right?
I don't know if it was
either
singular
apology or
plural.
apologies, but it was framed in that sort of, I'm running for president because Obama apologizes for America and I will stand up for it and so on. And I think that argument looks a lot weaker today than it did, a week ago or whenever before Osama bin Laden was killed. And I think that therefore it's more likely that you'll see Republicans. I mean, it's probably just more likely that this will force Republicans to sort of double down on domestic issues, and that there may not be a really strong Republican critique.
Look, we're going to have another guest. Joe Klein from Time is now going to join us. We're talking
this is just like Johnny Carson.
It is, right? You didn't know I was so professional. I had so much pull.
And you have all these couches with the extra space.
That's right.
And Anna Paquin will come on next, and Joe will have to move down.
If only we'll be cozying up
next time.
We're talking about election 2012. That the bin Laden killing means that there's not much for the Republicans to get their knickers in a twist about over foreign policy.
Right, I mean, they'll still get their knickers in a twist, but if you think back on, I just think it makes it more likely that this looks like the 1992 election, where Bill Clinton did have critiques of George H.W. Bush on foreign policy, I mean, on China, for instance, and I think you'll certainly hear, and Joe, you've talked about this, but the Republicans will find some line attacking Obama on China, but it's not going to be, I mean, it was never going to be the centerpiece of the campaign probably, but it's much less likely to be the centerpiece of the campaign now, because it's hard to run a he's a Carter-esque weakling campaign when he's just killed Osama bin Laden.
Well, what I think is that, foreign policy is used in presidential campaigns as a way of trying to define who your opponent is. And the American exceptionalism argument that the more high-minded candidates were using it was birtherism for high-mindedness. For the high-minded,
I see a column.
It was.
First, yeah.
No, I've written it. It's a way of saying he's not like us. He doesn't believe America is exceptional. Might not have even been born here, who knows? But he just doesn't have the same priorities that we do. His country he doesn't see the country the same way we do. And I think that that's still going to bubble up.
But I think that it was, the root of the American exceptionalism argument on the high-minded right, you might say, was an attempt to connect foreign policy to domestic policy directly and say, we know that, you know, given his druthers, Obama would prefer that the United States' social welfare system looked a little bit more like Western Europe. Therefore, we can extrapolate and say probably the same is true in foreign policy. And I agree that I think that you know, that sort of frame is potentially very powerful, but I just think the foreign policy side of it got a lot less powerful.
Well, what happens, I mean, do the Republicans, and what would seem to me, you know, wisen up at this point and say what we should look like is not neo-isolationist, because of course, you know, that's a bad word, but that we say we care about the budget. I mean, you're starting to hear more and more of this, and we don't want to be in lots of far-flung places, and they start to look a lot more like the kind of realist Republican Party. Do either of you see that happening, or it's just, you know, so out of the realm of where they've been that getting back there would be too difficult? I mean, do you have too many kind of McCains?
Well, I think that there are at least three strains in the Republican Party. The one that is most talked about in Washington has the least impact on the rest of the country, and that's the neoconservatives. You don't hear people making neoconservative arguments out in the middle of America. The strain that's more prominent there is the evangelical strain, which sees Israel and, you know, and the contest against Islam in very profound, you know, basic moral terms. And the third strain is the libertarian strain, which is, you know, we don't need to be doing this. And, you know, it was my theory and also my experience going around the country that the libertarian strain was gaining some real ground among the non-religious.
Is it? Are you seeing the same kind of thing? Where I feel like Ross is our lifeline into the
Into
Republican
religious
ranks.
believers,
Yes,
or
yes,
the Republican
all.
right? Well, I think that there are a lot of different ways you can sort of generalize, but another generalization you might make is that the Republican Party has a nationalist base, and the struggles in Republican foreign policy are between sort of realist / libertarian attempts to define what being a nationalist means, and neoconservative / internationalist attempts to define what being a nationalist means. And so in the late 1990s, it was easier for, you know, there is no realist base, right? There are no realists in sort of outside of Washington, and there are no neoconservatives outside of Washington. There are people who have different, you know, there are different ways that nationalism manifests itself, and there's sort of more religious strains of nationalism, more secular strains of nationalism, and so on. But basically, I think you have a sort of elite jockeying to try and sort of capture what it means to be an American nationalist, right? And so after 9/11, what it meant to be an American nationalist was, you know, going overseas and kicking some ass. And now what it means to be an American nationalist is, I think as Joe says, much more up for grabs, and it's much more ambiguous. Like, and you see this in figures like how Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin reacted to the Libya intervention. I think is, you know, Bachmann came out against it, and Palin sort of tap danced around, but clearly, you know, has ended up taking a more skeptical tack. And neither Sarah Palin nor Michelle Bachmann are going to be the Republican nominee, but they're good bellwethers, I think, for sort of where the grassroots are right now.
I think it's absolutely right. And in this case, the grassroots on both sides of the aisle are in the same place. There are an awful lot of Americans who are saying, we don't have the wherewithal to do that. And by the way, why are we falling behind China? We aren't, actually, but they really truly believe that we are.
Now let me ask both of you this. So are we going to be coming back from Afghanistan tout de suite with this, you know, election coming up, and plus I think, of course, the obvious point that you can use bin Laden and say, well, we're done with this whole war on terror?
Well, my sense is that we were going to be out of there with leaving behind a footprint of military trainers and some special ops people by the end of 2012 in any case, leaving maybe 20,000 troops behind. And that might be sped up now. You know, there may be more of a willingness for, you know, someone like Mullah Omar to actually say, you know, we don't want to have any part of Al-Qaeda. And there certainly is going to be more pressure on the president, I think, to come home, because the reason that he gave for, you know, amping up there was to go against Al-Qaeda.
And I've just never believed he was really all that gung-ho about Afghanistan once he got into office. There was sort of a sense,
He did lose.
I
he does leave that
committed
impression.
and now what do I do?
But it's interesting with the president, because he's had sort of two big moments with the troop surge in Afghanistan and then with Libya, and in both cases it was clear from everything from his public remarks to his body language that he wasn't gung-ho, but in both cases he made, in some form, the more hawkish decision.
Yeah, but that's, I think, isn't that what you want? Don't you want your president not to be gung-ho when it comes to, you know, overseas adventures in places that we don't know very well?
Right, well, we wish
Sure,
so
but
gung-ho
maybe,
that
but maybe
not
you'd like
going
him
at
not
all.
to.
When we have
in the
the-
case of Libya, at least, not.
Yeah.
Libya, this will be my closing question for you both. Does it hurt him? Does it matter? Helps him? We can't figure out for the life of us, we just had a 2-hour-long meeting about this, why he really went in the first place. So, does America care?
Not overall. I mean, I think this is the one, I agree with Joe's points about what's likely to happen in Afghanistan. The one caveat I would throw out there is that there's been a lot of room for sort of elite maneuver on Afghanistan, because you haven't seen it, even though the polls have turned against the war, there's nothing like the kind of sort of visceral, you know, we need to get out of there now feeling that you saw at work in like the 2006 election. It just hasn't been sort of a top of mind issue for voters, and it may be more of one in 2008 if we haven't started withdrawing, but it's still, and I think Libya, you may see the same dynamic, right? Whereas even if, I mean, you know, even if things do not go that well, it's not a huge military operation for the United States. People have bigger domestic concerns to worry about. I do think it makes, you know, the president is now in a position, though, where Gaddafi needs to be gone and pretty soon in order for it not to start hurting
Looking
him.
like a
Just
failure.
Yeah, I think that Ross made a point during the meeting that was, the key one here is that if Gaddafi is still in power a year from now, that's going to really hurt the president. For most people, most Americans, I think that Libya will end the moment that Gaddafi is gone. The reality is that
Libya begins.
that, you know, since it's mostly a tribal war, it's going to continue and continue and continue.
Well, let us only hope Obama is listening then. Thank you both for taking the extra time to do this.
My pleasure.